Resident Evil has been on a hot streak as of late. The franchise started out strong with the first 3 games being all-time classics in the survival horror genre, and Resident Evil 4 reinvented the franchise as well as survival horror games and the zombie genre in general. But after RE4, the franchise started to decline. While I personally have a soft spot for RE5, RE5 and 6 were not looked at highly by players, and had a lot of people questioning whether the franchise could survive. After a 5-year hiatus between mainline games, Resident Evil 7 brought back the franchise with a vengeance. It completely reinvented the franchise and was a massive success. After taking some time to make some incredible remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, the follow-up to Resident Evil 7 is finally here, Resident Evil 8 Village. This has been one of mine and the internet's most anticipated games of the year for a variety of different reasons, and after playing through the game, it's time that I give my thoughts on this new entry to one of my favorite video game franchises of all time. The biggest win for Resident Evil 8 is its gameplay. Village is, in a lot of ways, a companion piece to Resident Evil 7, so there's going to be a lot of comparisons between the two for this review. If you haven't played Resident Evil 7, you don't need to play Resident Evil 8, but it does certainly help. Village has a lot more combat than Resident Evil 7, which I personally found more enjoyable. I like horror games with less emphasis on stealth and avoiding enemies, and more of a focus on resource management, efficiently disposing enemies, and tense enemy encounters. That being said, the long time between combat in Resident Evil 7 made the enemies far more terrifying, and did a better job at keeping me on edge throughout my playthrough. This aspect will ultimately come down to personal preference, but if you don't like long sections without combat in your horror games, then you'll likely prefer Village over 7. Another part of Village's gameplay that I prefer over 7's is the difficulty and overall balance. Resident Evil 7 was a far more difficult game than Village, which has its pros and cons, but for general audiences, I would say Village does it better. My first playthrough was on the standard difficulty, and I didn't have an extremely challenging time. It wasn't easy by any means, but it wasn't as challenging as RE7's standard difficulty. If you're familiar with Resident Evil or any other survival horror game out there, then I would recommend playing the game on the hardcore setting. But if you're new to the franchise, the standard difficulty will be perfect, and if you're new to video games as a whole and somehow managed to find this video, casual is going to be great for, well, casual fun. The last thing I'll highlight before going into the cons is the variety of different environments and set pieces throughout the game. Without going into major spoilers, there are 4 main areas of the map and the village that starts out dangerous but becomes safer over time and connects to the other 4 areas as a sort of main hub. Each of these 4 areas has a very distinct look and switches up the gameplay. The castle feels more in line with Resident Evil 7 as well as the remakes of 2 and 3. Visually speaking, it's like nothing we've seen before in the series, and you have returning elements of those aforementioned games like collecting items to solve puzzles and unlock doors, and the large roaming enemy in the form of Lady Dimitrescu. Benevento's dollhouse is the most puzzle-centric area in the game and removes all combat for a while. The whole area has a Silent Hill PT vibe, especially with some of the darker places it takes you later on. At least for me, it's the scariest experience I've had with the series. Monroe's mines are the least distinct gameplay-wise, but it's one of my favorite parts of the game solely because of Monroe. The main boss is far more relatable than any villain in the series. He's very open about his flaws and how others look down on him, and his line makes for a pitiful yet funny experience. If you find self-deprecating humor as funny as I do, this will probably be one of your favorite areas to replay. Heisenberg's area is extremely claustrophobic, which gives it a distinct feel and look that the other areas don't have. For as much as Resident Evil Village got right, there's a couple of things that it could have done better. My biggest issue with Village is the story. Without going into spoilers, there's a lot of moments where exposition isn't super clear, particularly towards the ending. If you finished the game and were completely confused by everything happening in the last hour or so, I wouldn't blame you. There were also a lot of moments where I couldn't suspend my disbelief. There's always been moments where our main characters take a seemingly unsurvivable amount of damage and shrug it off. Hell, Ethan's hand got cut off and was stapled back on in the last game. But it happens multiple times throughout this game, and in ways that I wasn't comfortable with. I don't want to go into spoilers, but look at this scene and tell me I'm wrong.
good.
I don't care how many herbs you have, no one can fucking do that! The storyline also failed to connect this game as well as anything that happened since RE7 to any of the other games in the franchise. Aside from Chris Redfield, Umbrella, and a late reference to the BSAA, there are no connections to any other game in the franchise. You would think after this same criticism was levied against RE7, and after the massive success of the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, that there would be some mention to the over 20 years of lore these games are ignoring, but there isn't. Village also has a graphics problem on older consoles. All the gameplay in this video was recorded on a launch day Xbox One, and throughout my entire game there were problems loading textures and movements at a distance were choppy. Thankfully nothing affected my gameplay, but since the PS5 and Xbox Series X are still out of stock everywhere, this is likely the way most people are going to experience Village. I wouldn't say these problems are necessarily worth upgrading to the next consoles for, but if you can get it for next gen, then you should get it for next gen. Hopefully by the time this comes out, there will be some updates that help textures load on old hardware more consistently. Overall, Resident Evil Village is another hit in a long series of hits. I remember when people were really worried about the direction Resident Evil was going in, but now you have to go back nearly a decade to the last bad Resident Evil game. Resident Evil 7 was a massive bounce back for the series, and if the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 haven't made it clear already, Village confirms that Resident Evil is here to stay. But what do you think about Village? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.